Hi, thanks for watching. Okay, so this will be my second video on Dr. Ramani Durvasula. Okay, Dr. Ramani Durvasula is an emeritus professor of psychology, and she does have some professional experience with personality disorders. Okay, I don't think she's a major researcher in the area of personality disorders, but she has done laboratory work with personality disorders. And I think she is at least an authority, and she is a very popular influencer in the area, at least of narcissism. And so in this video, I'd like to focus on another problem I'm having with Dr. Ramani. Okay, in the first video, I talked about how maybe she has some personal bias, and maybe she's not really, she doesn't really have an objective position with regard to narcissism, just because she is herself, as has admitted, at least to some extent, a victim of narcissism. And so that might bias her perspective on narcissism. But in this video, I'd like to talk about her outlook in terms of how treatable narcissism is, or maybe to put it better, what narcissists can expect in terms of being able to improve themselves.
Then I did research into it. I'm like, wow, this is really not very treatable. The person with narcissistic personality disorder, and even the pattern really wasn't that changeable.
Okay, so I mean, she's taking a position that I think is actually pretty standard and I think pretty mainstream in psychology, that basically, and I think most psychologists will tell us this, that basically personalities don't really change. So the question for me then, if we agree, and I kind of agree, I mean, if personalities don't really change that much, okay, there's only two real options in terms of a prognosis for somebody with narcissism or some other personality disorder, okay? There's only two options. You can either try to change what you can of something that doesn't really change that much. Okay, so if personalities don't change that much, you can work really hard to change it a little bit. And so basically you have that one alternative, which you can just expect a very modest change because personalities don't change that much. So you could have very modest expectations. Okay, or the alternative would be something like Alcoholics Anonymous, okay, or certain addictions recovery, where they assume they'll always be alcoholics. So they don't even try to change the fact that they're addicts, right? And yet they still expect lots of changes because I guess they have maybe a more spiritual approach. Okay, so which is going to be the approach that Dr. Ramani takes?
If there is a narcissist out there who stumbles upon this video because everybody in their life has told them you're a narcissist, and they have even a little bit of self-awareness, maybe I am, what do you think they will gain out of this?
This has become the question of the year, because I get emails almost every day from a person. Some of them are angry, some of them are downright threatening, and some of them are really contrite, where they're saying, I'm this person and I don't want to be this person anymore. And I've hurt people. Give me that person and we might have a little hope. Now, here's the rub. A person, let's say, lifelong narcissist, they're 30, 40, 50 years old. This is how they've always treated people. It's a tough fix. It's almost like trying to take someone who's really sweet and making them mean. Not easy to do. It's the same thing. We're just trying to flip it out in the other direction.
Okay, so from what we can see here, okay, it's pretty clear that Dr. Ramani's approach, and I think psychology's general approach, I think she does represent mainstream psychology. I think the approach is generally, okay, we'll try to help you change your personality. And yes, you probably can change your personality, but because personalities don't change that much, the expectations are they're kind of like very, very modest expectations. Okay. In other words, we'll work really, really hard. We'll do a lot of therapy and we'll focus on what we can change of your personality. But the idea is that we're going to focus on what we can change of something that doesn't really change that much. So basically, the expectation is very modest.
What you might see is that you might get some small fixes from them, but I do think all is not lost. I think if somebody is narcissistic and is willing to do the hard yards and put their head down, commit with a good therapist, really commit to mindfulness every day, you might get someone where you might get enough of a change where their family notices a difference. They may become a somewhat better parent. They might become a somewhat better partner. I mean, I think, are you ever going to make them the sweet, agreeable teddy bear? Probably not.
Okay, so here I actually do sort of agree with Dr. Ramani, okay, in the sense that I agree with her. I agree that personalities really don't change that much. And if we're going to focus on changing the personality, we're going to have very modest expectations. I totally agree. In fact, I'll even go a step further. I actually don't think personalities change much at all. Okay, so while she's promising, like this kind of modest thing, I would say that in reality, if you're just going to try to focus on changing your personality, I would say it might not even be as much as what she says. I think you might as well not expect really much of any change. Okay, and so my concern with Dr. Ramani then is, because we do have the example of some addictions recovery, like Alcoholics Anonymous, and it's just an example. I don't personally like Alcoholics Anonymous, but they show us an example where people take a different approach, where they just assume, hey, I'm checkmated on the personality, right? I'm checkmated. I'm not ever going to hope to be not an alcoholic, right? So that I'm already checkmated there. So instead of trying to change what you cannot change, you actually try to open up other dimensions of experience that might not have to do with the core personality. And I think this is kind of the frontier of psychology. Maybe this is almost like the limit of psychology, where psychology sort of runs into a frontier with philosophy and maybe even with spirituality. Okay. And I want to be so careful, because I'm not talking about spirituality in supernatural, cartoonish terms. Okay. I'm not talking about ghosts or any kind of naive, cartoonish notion of spirituality. I think of spirituality as having perspective beyond the personality. Okay. In other words, it's sort of like the philosophical position that there's more to us than just the activated reactive personality. Okay. In a way, it's kind of similar to Scientology, where if there's one good thing in Scientology, is that they do seem to understand that there's a part of us that's sort of the reactive operator. Okay. And then there's something beyond us. And of course, they talk about it in terms of an eternal spirit. I don't buy into the eternal stuff or any of the cartoon stuff, but I do think there's something to us that's more than just the reactive personality. Okay, so then what do I really mean by beyond the personality? Okay, when I say beyond the personality, maybe that's not the best phrase. Okay, I just don't know that in psychology we have a good phrase to talk about what's beyond the traditional personality. Okay, so let me try to explain what I mean. I do think that psychology is very limited to the personality sort of within the framework of attitudes and emotions. Okay, attitudes and emotions. Okay, so for me, spirituality is where we try to access the parts of ourselves that are sort of beyond the traditional personality. And what that means is beyond basic attitudes and emotionality, right? Basic attitudes and emotions. So basically, I use the word spirituality. I don't really want to use the word spirituality, but I feel like psychology is they're so sort of nestled within that world of attitudes and emotionality, attitudes and emotions. It's really hard for me to see, even though they talk about it, like psychology talks about mindfulness and all this kind of stuff, but I really do believe that they really focus on the part of us that's really basically very emotional and very sort of where attitudes and emotions sort of exist. So I try to emphasize something that I don't really see so much in psychology, which is a really much more detached aspect of ourselves, which really does appreciate and navigate the world, but really beyond the orbit, beyond the orbit of our basic emotions and attitudes, a more detached kind of way of approaching the world. And I don't want to call that spiritual, but I do call it spiritual because I think it's important to distinguish that it is beyond the basic core reactive self or the core reactive personality. And I do think that the parts of us that do relate to the world through a more detached perspective, I really don't think that they're part of the basic core personality, if you want to talk about the reactive personality. So I guess I do like that distinction between the part of us that's reactive and the part of us that has attitudes and emotions, and the part of us that really is kind of indifferent. So this is where I'd like to propose kind of an alternative approach, okay, to I think the two big barriers to the traditional methods of dealing with narcissism, okay? The two biggest barriers that we run into when we're dealing with a traditional approach to narcissism, number one is the core so-called insecurity and emptiness, okay? Insecurity and emptiness.
So why is it that I can change an undesirable behavior, but someone who has narcissistic personality disorder can't change?
Because the core conflict is that insecurity, that discomfort with themselves, that sense of emptiness. That's what has to be addressed. So you may have seen that, but it clearly didn't result in that kind of core insecurity perhaps in you.
Mhm.
I think what I see is when narcissists do enter treatment and become self-aware, the thing that they become self-aware of, and this is where it gets painful, is the emptiness and how insecure they really are. And that is one really tough look in the mirror. That's what they were avoiding all along. That's why they're so grandiose. I don't want to see the emptiness. So when we strip away that veil, and I've worked with many clients where we finally got to the core of the insecurity, they actually became downright depressed.
Wow.
And that's what they were trying to avoid all along.
Right. And so basically psychology kind of runs into this wall, all right, and they don't know how to get through it because they're like, well, you're always going to have this insecurity and emptiness, and we don't know any way to sort of solve that problem. You're always going to have to deal with your insecurity and your emptiness. It's like this, they look at it kind of like this limit, okay? Whereas I look at it from a different perspective. Basically, sometimes I wonder if maybe for a lot of people, part of their barrier to becoming more mature in life is that maybe there is sort of an eternal emptiness and insecurity that we all experience, right? Or maybe some of us more than others, right? But maybe the real mark of maturity in a person is you sort of get over it, in the sense that you just learn to live as a mature person with the fact that life does have kind of an emptiness and a sort of meaninglessness to it, right? And that we don't have to look at that as pathological, but philosophically we could say that maybe that is maybe one perspective of the human condition, which is that we are sort of in a way empty, and maybe our lives are kind of in a way sort of meaningless, okay? And so, and also the idea of insecurity, you know, why do we have to make insecurity such a pathological concept, right? Maybe insecurity we could look at as just a byproduct of a certain temperament, right? If you have a temperament that tends to be kind of aggressive, right? Kind of competitive and aggressive, you're naturally going to have a baseline that feels what we would call insecure. Okay. It means you're kind of edgy, kind of antsy and edgy, right? And what, instead of pathologizing that and looking at that as a problem to be removed, why don't we just accept that that's just a byproduct? It just goes with the package of having kind of a competitive or anxious temperament, or maybe a competitive or an impatient, like an more edgy temperament, right? So we could look at that as just a natural byproduct of maybe some of the more aggressive personality types or temperamental types, right? So instead of trying to like looking at that as a problem to be removed, we could just accept it as just a byproduct of our natural temperament, which we just have to learn to live with, right? And so instead of looking at, oh, but he has this insecurity, or oh, he has this emptiness, stop looking at that as a problem. Okay, maybe a lot of people have that as like a baseline, and it's just a mark of immaturity that you don't just get used to it, right? And you don't learn how to live with it, right? So maybe instead of looking at this as, oh my God, he has this insecurity, or why does he have this emptiness or whatever, we could say, well, emptiness and insecurity, that's just a universal experience for a lot of people, right? And so that maybe the question is more just adapting to something that is universal instead of trying to make it look like a pathological characteristic, right? We could look at it more as a universal characteristic. And of course, not everybody has these characteristics, but many, many people do have sort of chronic emptiness and chronic insecurity. It's just part of their temperament. And the real mark of becoming more mature is just learning how to live with it. Then we have another barrier in psychology, okay? And this is the other barrier that I think really affects the optimism or the lack of optimism in psychology, or maybe the lack of ability to deal with narcissism, which is this other barrier and this hang up I think we see in psychology, this hang up with, I think, their very ethnocentric and very politically problematic conception of empathy. Okay, empathy. I think empathy is a very problematic concept, okay? And I think we need to really focus on it, all right? Because empathy is basically a word that psychologists use in their ethnicity, in their subculture, the subculture of psychology. Empathy is basically just a fancy way of saying that you care and that you appreciate, okay, that I have care and appreciation for things, right? And so they want to jam all of that into this fancy artificial term called empathy, okay? And empathy just means, I think what it really means is just you want to approach the world through a very emotional, like you want to have a very emotional manner of caring and appreciating things.
When we were raising our kids, the one thing we 100% agreed upon, he's like, Ramani, we have a lot of things we have to get right, but we looked at each other and said, the one thing we must make sure we focus on above all else, because we only get one chance to get this right, is empathy.
Is empathy.
We didn't care how they did in school. We didn't care if they didn't eat their vegetables. We didn't care if they watched television 10 hours a day. We just needed them to be empathic.
And I think this fanaticism with empathy, where empathy becomes the be all and the end all, it's almost like a new god, in this subculture. And you have to be really careful. Whenever a subculture elevates something to this be all massive, like this is the only good thing, like there's no other important thing, we should be concerned and suspicious, all right? Because that's typically what happens when people become religious and fanatical, all right? And so, because we live in a world where we've sort of eliminated religion from, we've eliminated sort of expressed religion, from our consciousness, because it's just out of fashion, basically, except for in some subcultures, in the subculture of psychology, they're going to have some religious tendency, okay, because we all have religious and ideological tendencies. And so we can see that one of the gods, let's say, one of the gods of the psychological subculture is this massive thing they call empathy. It's like their deity, because it's not just, if they wanted to say that empathy just means that you care and that you appreciate things, they would just use the words care and appreciation. No. They want to distinguish themselves as a subculture, okay, by promoting this idea that only if you're an emotional person, and only if you relate to people through emotionality, do you qualify as a valid person. Okay, anything less is there's something wrong with you, and you have to have this full emotional empathy, okay, in order to qualify as a full human. All right, and I think that this is very problematic, right? Because in the real world, outside of the subculture of psychology, there are lots of ways that you can care about and appreciate things without being an emotional person. Okay, so this to me almost sounds like the polemic between the North and the South in, like, say, in European cultures, where the northern European cultures, they're considered to be like very dry and unemotional. But then as you go down to Spain and Italy and maybe the Middle East, people are more emotional, and the colder Northern Europeans think that they're better, and then the southern, the more Mediterranean people who are more emotional, they think that they're better, and that the Northerners are too cold. This sounds to me more like an ethnic sort of a rivalry, almost like an ethnic rivalry, where the subculture of psychology, they identify themselves as having more emotionality, but they want to use that kind of bigoted attitude of pointing to people who are not so emotional and kind of indirectly developing like this kind of ideological framework where they can sort of almost look down on people and try to assert their superiority, and almost make it so that emotionality is a sign of superiority.
Let's say a really high functioning, empathic, solid person is sitting up here. The kind of person who's going to take care of you if you're sick and is there for you and doesn't need validation all the time. Okay. And a narcissist is down here. Okay. Or even down here.
Mm-hmm.
We're not getting him here.
Right.
We're not getting him here. We're going to get him here. And maybe that's enough. That might be enough to say, all right, I'll stay in the marriage. I realize it's not satisfying. Or someone's like, all right, I'll try to cultivate a relationship with my dad, but realize it may not be what I wanted. Or, yeah, okay, like, I can try to keep working with this person. If you getting them from here to here is Herculean. This isn't possible. And if this is the standard, it's not going to fly.
So Dr. Ramani is basically saying that basically the highest level of a human being is this kind of emotionality, empathy, this kind of relating to people and appreciating people through emotionality, okay? And that anything less, whether it's a narcissist or not, really, I mean, she's using this as a contrast to narcissism, but really, I think she would really say that anybody, regardless of whether they're narcissistic, if they don't have this kind of emotionality of relating to others, they sort of live in this sort of inferior place, and she's even using the hand gestures of what's higher and what's lower, okay? And basically saying that, if you're limited in your ability to have effective like affection, like emotional affection, relatedness to others, and then basically you're just kind of this inferior person, okay? And I think this is really telltale. I'm glad she did this, okay? Because I think psychology, they never want to look bad. They never want to look bad, and they always want to hedge, and they're even willing to change their definitions just to not look bad. But I think what psychology is hiding, and really hiding in plain sight, is they have a kind of a very narrow idea of what it means to relate to others and to relate to the world through appreciation and caring. Okay, what does it mean to say that I care about things, that I appreciate things? Okay, but not always through their brand of emotionality. Okay. Because just like different ethnicities are different throughout the world, some ethnicities are drier, some are more affective, have more emotional affect. Just like if you go from, like, say, Scandinavia to like Italy or Spain or or Greece or whatever, or even Israel or the Middle East, people are going to have different sort of emotionalities in the way that they approach and care, and it's just so typical of cultures to say, oh, we have the better way. Likewise, the same with psychology. They obviously have a bias towards a more emotionality, towards more emotionality in the way that we care and appreciate.
And there is an interesting concept out there, and it's something actually even in my social media, someone that we've engaged on, about this idea of cognitive empathy. You can teach people, like, that's how he feels. Okay, got it. Do you understand why that would feel bad? Got it. That's almost intellectualized, and it's a little bit different than being in the emotional muck with someone. I
Is
don't
it
think
like acting?
it's not. No, it's not acting. It's
Okay.
knowing, but it's
Knowing.
not getting. You see
I
what
don't
I'm saying?
understand. No, I don't understand that.
I know why this person would feel upset right now. I know that.
Yeah.
Might even get it a little bit, but I'm not feeling it so much so that it'll stop my behavior in the future.
Right.
So it's like a half of a fix. And when you're really in a close, intimate relationship with someone, and the best they can come up with is like, I suppose I understand why you feel that way, but they're still not like, and they're not emotionally there with you. It's incredibly unsatisfying.
Okay, so this part honestly does really bother me. Okay, it really does bother me because I think even Dr. Ramani knows better. Okay, I think she's so trapped in her ethnocentric bias towards emotionality that I think she has just forgotten in the course of her, she's into this ideological passion, of trying to promote her version of the superior person, right? I think she's forgotten that there are many, many ways that don't involve emotionality. Okay, there are many ways to have appreciation and concern and care for other people, all right, or to care about things. Okay, and I think what she's describing is cartoonish and exaggerated, right? Just like, and this is the way that different ethnicities like to criticize each other. It's almost like listening to somebody from North Korea propaganda, like talking about Americans. She's making a cartoon. Okay, now yes, there are people who not only don't have emotional empathy, but they also don't really care. Okay, now that's different. She's consolidating two concepts into one, and so she's hiding the ball on the other issue. Okay, in other words, when a person is acting the way she describes with the cartoon of cognitive empathy, where it's like, oh, I know how you feel, but it's obvious that I don't care. What she's really describing is not just a person who doesn't feel what you feel, but on top of that, a person who doesn't even really honestly care how you feel. Okay, those are two things, and she's collapsing them, and therefore she's sort of hiding the ball of a separate factor. Okay, and this is important because she's too much of a scientist to get away with that, right? She's too much of a scientist, too much of a professional, and this is where I think she's revealing how psychology really has an ideological interest in promoting a subculture and an ethnicities, or a family of ethnicities that are more emotional. It sort of really is, I think, really, this is really kind of an ideological issue with psychology, all right? Because what she's really describing is not just a person who doesn't share your feelings, okay? What she's really describing is a person who maybe doesn't share your feelings, but also doesn't really care, and is just going through the mimicry and just going through the motions of trying to make you think that they care, okay? And so this is the thing, all right? The issue is not necessarily whether you're going to get somebody to share your feelings. And in the real world, we know there are many times, and I've even noticed this even with psychologists and therapists, where they don't really share my feelings, but at least they show that they care about how I feel. Okay. And so you don't have to share someone's feelings to appreciate how they feel and to care about how they feel. So what she described in this cognitive empathy is really not just cognitive empathy, it's also cognitive empathy plus not even caring. Okay. So what I'm suggesting is that there are ways to care and there are ways to appreciate things without being emotionally sharing what the other person is experiencing, right? And so this to me, this is very important. And I think this is the gateway to why I think a more spiritual approach will help with psychology, because I honestly think I honestly think that as a subculture and as an ethnicity, I think psychology is not very spiritual. Okay. I think they're materialistic. And what I mean by materialistic is more on the philosophical definition of materialism, where basically the idea is this immanence, where you're sort of like located only in the area of the passions. Okay. And you try to sort of avoid sort of the more detached perspective. Okay. And the fact is that some people just are not that emotional. Okay. And it could even be a sign of being more mature, right? As you become more mature, you become more detached, more neutral, more kind of matter of fact, right? And some people are more matter of fact, and that's actually a sign of maturity, not immaturity. And it's not a sign of being inferior. It may even be a sign of being more advanced as a person. Okay. But even if you are kind of detached, you can still care about things and appreciate things. Okay. And that may be the thing that's missing, I think, in some personality disorders. It's not how emotional you are. The real issue, the thing that really makes people dysfunctional, is maybe they have a deficit in even just caring or even appreciating things. Okay. So instead of focusing on this kind of ethnocentric interest in emotionality, I think it's better to focus on, and we should all focus on, how much we actually care about things and how much we actually appreciate things. Also, I really object to this term cognitive empathy, because it almost like tries to create a contrast to what they call like the superior empathy. And by using the word cognitive empathy, it's almost like, oh, this is almost like the robotic empathy of somebody who's just a pure cognitive entity, just has cognition with no feelings. I think that's really unfortunate. And I think psychology is kind of loaded with this sort of low grade, very subtle sort of ridiculizing of people that aren't in their, like, say, favored ethnic status, basically. Their preferential ethnic status for them is some kind of ethnicity or subculture or cultural identification that's more emotional, that has more emotionality. And so they have these little tiny ways of sort of disparaging people that aren't at their ideal. And they have this almost kind of like almost this way of sort of disparaging and ridiculizing people by using this clinical vocabulary, like, oh, cognitive empathy, like you're talking about a robot. And the bottom line is, I'm trying to remind people of something we already know deep down inside, which is that there are lots of ways to care, and there's lots of ways to have appreciation without being an emotional person. All right. And we need to rescue that, and we need to be open about that. Right. And so it's not just cognitive empathy, it's just a less emotionality kind of empathy. All right. It's a kind of a appreciation. Well, I don't even want to use the word empathy. I don't want to use their word. Right. We don't need the word empathy. Empathy is not a necessary word. We already have appreciation. We already have caring. Okay. There are ways you can care and appreciate without being emotional, without having emotionality. So in this chart, what I've tried to describe is how not everybody is sort of a feeling type. All right. Some people do relate to others by feeling, or at least through emotionality, right? Sort of like the feeling types, right? There are those types of people, but there are also people who relate to people through sensing. Not through feeling so much, but through sensing, like sensing how they feel. You don't have to be a psychopath to have that. There's lots of people. I think the world is really broken into maybe three main categories of how we relate to others and how we relate to situations. Right? Some people are more primarily. Some people are more primarily emotional, and they're sort of feelers. Like I relate to the world through feeling. And feeling is sort of the dominant way of relating to other people and other situations, right? Other people are more sensate, more sensory, where they're sort of like sensing things, like even intuitive types, right? There are people who are very intuitive, and they sort of relate to things by how they sense other situations, other people, right? And then there are other people who are a little more mental, a little more cognitive, I would say. And it's not so much sensing. It's not so much sensing or feeling, but it's more just perception, just pure perception, right? So some people are more perceptive or perceptual or perceptual. Other people are more like through sensing, and other people are more by feeling, right? And these are just different types that we have, all right? But I don't think it's fair for psychology to create sort of a bias or a prejudice where only the feeling types can reach like the full limit of the human experience. They're the only ones that can become fully actualized humans. Okay, whereas the more perceptive or the more sensate or the more the more perceptive or the more sensate types, that somehow they're condemned to a lower order of human experience. I think that's very unrealistic, and I think it's very I think it's kind of prejudiced. It's kind of prejudiced, and I think sometimes, when you look at like philosophers or good novel writers, some of them are more intuitive than they are emotional, and some people are actually more perceptive than they are intuitive, and they can also have great appreciation, even like say philosophers or mathematicians. Okay, these are not inferior people. This is not like a subhuman kind of category, and so I think all different types of people can reach a higher level, even the feeling types, all of us can reach a higher level of appreciation and caring, appreciation, understanding, and caring. Okay. It's not just coming from the empathic. It can also come from just intuitive perception or intuitive sensing, not just through emotionality. Right. So, because narcissism and things like antisocial, because narcissistic people and antisocial people, because they do fall on the more aggressive end of the temperamental spectrum, okay? And because people, I think in the psychological community, I think they perceive themselves to be more passive and agreeable. I don't know that they're actually more passive and agreeable. I think they're more emotional. Okay, so I think here we are, conflating and confusing all these things. I think the subculture of psychology includes very aggressive people. Okay, but I think they use their emotionality as like a substitute for being more agreeable. Okay, and that we should not allow that to happen. Okay, people who are agreeable are people who are agreeable. All right. And even disagreeable people can learn to be they don't become temperamentally agreeable, but they can learn to become more congenial, okay, through just being more mature, right? And likewise, a more emotional person can become more agreeable, okay, but that's also through maturity. That's not just because you come out of the box that way necessarily, right? And so, psychologists, they like to see themselves as more agreeable, but I think they're using their emotionality as like a substitute, right? And it's kind of a game they play. And I think it's done very unconsciously, because I think they're subconsciously involved in an ethnic superiority campaign, which we're all involved. I mean, every ethnicity has that. I think that a subconscious desire to become the dominant ethnicity, right? And so they use the fact that their emotionality, they have emotionality. They use their emotionality as a substitute for being more agreeable. But really, in terms of temperament, I think they're just more emotional. And they just have more emotionality. But because narcissists fall on this more kind of disagreeable, kind of aggressive end of the spectrum, okay, I think basically psychology just wants to, in little ways, it sort of serves their purpose to say that these people, they can be saved, but only so much. We always need to have kind of an asterisk, kind of a suspicion of people who are more aggressive, or people who are more aggressive or more dominant in terms of their personality temperament, in terms of their temperament, basically. So it's not really so much about personality, it's more about temperament. And I would say that, if we're only looking at just our personality and our reactive temperament, I would say they're right. Okay. However, I think because psychology doesn't really have an extra dimension for a more spiritual approach, okay, they're overlooking the ways that even people who are on the more aggressive end of the spectrum, how they can also develop. But it's not going to be either by becoming emotional or by improving their personality. Okay, it's going to be through some other means. All right, and this is what I think is not emphasized enough, and I really don't think it's really something that's even compatible with psychology as it exists today. So if I were to try to guess at a new frontier for psychology in terms of dealing with personality disorders, okay, I would look more towards something a little more spiritual in a more modern, in a modern sense, not in a traditional sense, but spiritual in the sense of getting beyond the personality, okay? And I think if we really open our eyes, we'll see there are lots of people whose way of maturing is not by having better personalities, but lots of people, they already know how to mature, and they already give us examples of how maturity is possible without improving the personality, okay? And that maybe we need to maybe not get so focused on the personality, and maybe emphasize more the aspects of ourselves that can maybe achieve more perspective and understanding despite having a bad personality, or let's say a problematic temperament. you know? And so I think that's really where I would want to look in terms of a future, because I think we've already shown over decades that by just focusing on the personality, I think, in psychology admits it, we don't really improve people. Okay. So in the next videos, if I'm going to do more videos on Dr. Ramani, I'm going to try and focus on this more. I would call it a more spiritual or just a more perspective oriented approach. Okay. And I really appreciate your patience, and thanks for watching.